Next we have Bill Tait. And from the title, this could be a response to Bill Wimsatt's paper, but I doubt it is. And Bill Tait is going to give us a defense of the idea. Welcome for Bill.
It's been a pleasure to listen to all these talks, and I'm very thankful for the organizers for having organized it and celebrating Howard's work. It's been an even greater pleasure to have been a colleague and friend of Howard's all of these years. The intersection of our work actually is somewhat different from the subject matter of most of the talks in the conference. It's been in, I guess I call it the history of the foundations of mathematics. Probably the main papers of Howard's in that area are these two, Logos, Logic, and Logisticae. That's a paper, a very influential paper, I think, in people who talk about foundations of mathematics. I think what it did was to display the evolution of mathematics from calculation and construction in say the 18th century to mathematics as being about structures, about structures. The paper talks only really about developments in number theory and algebra. As he points out himself, he says nothing about function theory, for example, Riemann's work on Riemann surfaces, things like that. And that's kind of a pity that no one's followed up on it. I mean, there is more work to be done in that respect on early 19th century mathematics, function theory analysis. Second paper is fun. That there were critics of Dedekind and his construction of the real numbers using Dedekind cuts that amounted to saying that he was just redoing Eudoxus' work, or whoever it was who was responsible for book 5 in the Elements. And what Howard pointed out was that there's this difference that certainly the Eudoxian theory said that every ratio determines a cut in the rationals, but the point of the difference was that for Dedekind the cuts determined the number, so it was the other way around. Anyway, I think that was the main point of that paper. I'm sorry that I have nothing to talk about in this intersection of our two fields, so I'm going to do a bit of soft philosophy, something that I've also been interested in. It's about the defense of the ideal, about critique of the idea of ideal object, and there's a subtext which has to do with an interpretation of Wittgenstein that's rather different from the ordinary interpretation of him as a skeptic. I mean, it doesn't cure all his ills, but I don't remember really talking to Howard much about Wittgenstein. We had one conversation, I think it was, we were driving somewhere, so it couldn't have been too long. And I was in fact explaining pretty much the interpretation of them that I'll talk about here. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, what he suggested was that we could find it all in Plato's 7th letter. But I have no idea. I haven't checked to see what that means now. Anyway, let me begin. I should say, don't be worried about this thick sheaf of papers. Something's happened to one of my eyes, so I had to blow the thing up so I can actually read it. A historic skepticism about mathematics hangs on the fact that the objects, namely structures and their elements, numbers, functions, sets, whatever, are ideal. By this I mean that empirical facts about the natural world have no relevance to truth about them. And precisely because of this irrelevance, the skeptic holds that we can't meaningfully speak of, much less have knowledge of, ideal things. Of course, the view that existence simply means empirical existence, so that the term is misused applied to ideal things, can only be countered on pragmatic grounds, namely that we do use the term in other contexts and that it's very useful there. The rejection of ideal existence becomes meaningful only if one has a transcendental ground on which to stand and judge applications of the existential quantifier. I believe that the ground that, at least implicitly, has been historically a thesis about the nature of language and how language works. And that's what I want to talk about. So, as I'm defining them, ideal objects are not in the natural world, but that's not all of it. The human species and the set of chairs in this room are also not in the natural world. But what is empirically true is relevant to what is true about them nonetheless. The sermon I'm going to preach applies to, with obvious adjustments, to these mixed objects too. For the position I want to undermine gives a special role to natural objects. But to keep things simple, I'll speak only of ideal things, the objects of pure mathematics. It's been customary in philosophy in relatively recent times to speak of abstract rather than ideal objects. Let me briefly explain my choice of terminology. As Frege noted, abstract objects, properly speaking, ought to be abstracted from something. They're formed by taking something away. And the truth of what I say about the abstract object is derived from the truth about the object from which it's abstracted. And so abstraction from empirical things yields only empirical things. Incidentally, a central ontological issue between Plato and Aristotle concerned whether the objects of geometry, say, are ideal or are abstract. Certainly, if one takes them to be abstract, then one must reject the existence of such things as points, lines, and surfaces, which we regard as basic geometric objects, but which can't be regarded as abstracted from nature. And indeed, Aristotle and his followers in the Middle Ages did reject them. One can see in Occam's writings a precursor of Whitehead's method of extensive abstraction and in fact present as point-free topology and geometry. But the realism-nominalism issue of the Middle Ages was not about the existence of ideal objects such as these, but rather of abstract objects, and in particular of universals. The issue was whether in the sentences Socrates is human and Plato is human, there is some one thing, a universal, being denoted by human. Of course, these abstract objects are not ideal, and in particular are not mathematical objects. We can replace the universal by the class of things falling under it, assuming, contrary to fact, in at least most cases, that the class is well defined. And it's in this way that perhaps that the issue of the existence of abstract objects joined the 20th century debate over the existence of mathematical objects. But the class corresponding to an empirical universal, well defined or not, is not an ideal object either. Also, abstraction occurs in mathematics too, in the form of the so-called forgetful functor, as when we abstract from a ring its additive group or the set of its elements. It follows that the distinctions empirical, ideal, and concrete, abstract cut across each other, and so both of them should be retained. So that's the end of my sermon about the use of the term abstract. Quine attempted to break down the distinction between empirical and ideal by noting that the statement that there is no ratio between the number of centaurs and the number of unicorns has empirical content. But there's an ideal content of the statement, namely that division by zero is undefined, and this is the mathematical fact. The statement about centaurs and unicorns is an application of this fact to mixed objects, the set of unicorns, etc. There might have been an animal sufficiently endowed to be called a unicorn, and in that case there would be a ratio, but it's not possible that zero has a reciprocal. Even when, for some empirical concept f, the number of f's is well-defined, the number of f's is a well-defined number n, we can separate the mathematical properties of n from the empirical fact that it's a number of f's. Rejecting mathematics is strong medicine, and from Aristotle in 4th century BC to Quine, at least ultimately in the 20th, the skepticism about ideal has often been paired with the denial that mathematics is about ideal things, that in one way or another empirical truth is relevant to mathematical truth. Note that the issue is not whether empirical conditions have influenced the development of mathematics. Obviously they have. The issue is about the nature of mathematics itself. And in all of its forms, empiricism has fared badly with mathematics, both as it was in Aristotle's time, as Plato had already noted, and as it has been ever since. In more recent times, the need to replace the geometric foundation for the theory of real numbers by an arithmetic foundation led to the explicit introduction of the actual infinite into mathematics, and surely a challenge to empiricism. One empiricist's reaction to this has been an attempt to place the objects of mathematics not in the domain of outer experience, but in the domain of inner experience, in the mind, with an attendant restriction on the laws of mathematical logic to those that can be understood as expressing mental operations. But whatever the attractions of this constructive development of mathematics holds, and in whatever sense it succeeds in avoiding the actual infinite, I will believe that it avoids the ideal only if I understand how I can mentally construct 10 to the power 10 to the power 10. In both individually and we can suppose as a species, language began for us with the everyday language of observable things and events, and that language remains basic to our linguistic activity. The explicit introduction of ideal objects seems to have been, as far as we, or anyway I know, at the 4th century BC Greece. Even the grammatical categories of talk about the ideal are derived from the grammar of talk about natural things. But this is an issue concerning priority, not ontological or epistemological legitimacy. The step from the animal recognition of sensible objects and sensible properties to language in which we conceptualize and communicate with each other and ourselves about them and their workings was large and, I would suppose, decisive in the development of our species. But in the search for further patterns in these workings and to state precise laws governing them, we were led to idealize, and from that inevitably to the consideration of ideal things. The point here is idealization lies, it's not literally true, whereas consideration of ideal things leads to a new kind of truth. That was a large step too, endowing us with, as Richard Dedekind suggested, a godlike creative power. A natural view of language and how it works seems to reinforce the target skepticism. It is the view that language as representation of objects, events, facts, etc., and involves the idea that words name things and that the relationship among the words in an elementary atomic sentence expresses a certain relationship among the corresponding named things. There's nothing wrong with this picture as the first step in a program for describing the semantics of a language. The truth definition relative to a model of a formal language shows how it works for those straight-laced fragments of language that can be regimented into such a framework. Of course, language serves functions in our lives other than this representational one, but it's a mistake to think that even where it applies, this semantics provides a ground for rejecting the ideal. The view that it does assumes that this or that domain of discourse is given to us as a well-determined, discriminated structure upon the elements of which we hang our words. And it is given to us extra-linguistically since it is already presupposed for the understanding or use of language. A clear example of this point of view may be found in the works of in Paul Banasreff's Mathematical Truth. I won't read it since you can. Probably more easily. An obvious difficulty with the truth definition as an account of meaning is that it gives it's given in a meta-language. But what is the meta-language for English, for example? In fact, on Tarski's definition of truth, the sentence S is true simply unpacks into a translation of S into a meta-language. One is just repeating S, but in another language. Indeed, on any account of truth, the grounds for asserting S as truth should be the same as the grounds for asserting S. This, of course, does not mean that the predicate is true, it's superfluous, since there are meaningful sentences such as not every sentence is true, not to say embarrassing ones like this sentence is false, in which the predicate is non-eliminable. Within mathematics also, there is a role for the Tarski definition of truth, namely truth in a given mathematical structure. But in this case, we're restricting the notion of truth to the language associated with that particular structure, and the associated meta-language is the language of mathematics. Beginning with, at least with Aristotle's own interpretations, the investigation of notions of meaning and understanding, i.e. grasping meaning, have been bound up with the idea of the mind as intermediary between words and that to which they refer. Meaning is conferred on my words by what, in some sense, I have in my mind when I utter them, and what I have in mind is the result of my interaction with whatever it is, object, property, fact, to which I'm referring. And we have more or less successfully communicated when the meaning, that meaning coincides more or less with what you have in mind when you hear them. I will comment further on Banasreff's reference to a causal theory of reference, other than to note that it refers to an attempted repairs of this old idea that I've just described to account for knowledge of things that we don't immediately perceive. Augustine's recorded conception of language, part of which Wittgenstein somewhat misleadingly quotes at the beginning of Philosophical Investigations, was in fact a part of a tradition stemming from on interpretations according to which there is a natural language of the mind in contrast to the conventional language by means of which we communicate. On this conception, learning a conventional language is learning to translate between it and the natural language of the mind. On the view of meaning as located in the intervening mind, meaning and understanding are the same thing. My meaning when I am speaking, and your meaning when you're understanding. So to talk about meaning and understanding is to talk about individual meanings internal to the agent, whether speaker or hearer. From this point of view, and quoting John Searle, one of his prominent contemporary advocates, the philosophy of language is a branch of the philosophy of mind. It's a view that draws considerable support from what one may call the view from inside, from our introspective sense of autonomy, that the meaning of the words that I speak is the meaning with which I endow them. One might call this also this view of meaning in or conferred by the mind in all of its forms, the Aristotelian point of view, not only because of the source and on interpretation, but because of Aristotle's emphasis on the autonomy of substances. There's no relationships among substances that are essential to any of them. Just as in Aristotelian physics, the explanation of natural change of state of a substance involves only something internal to the substance. So the position in question holds that the meaning of what one says is something essentially internal to the agent. If I speak meaningfully or understand what is said to me, this is a fact about me, in its essence, is independent of what is external to me. Being rational is somehow about me essentially, and is not to be explained by my functioning as a relatively well-behaved unit in a network of interactions. One inevitable consequence of this view is that languages are essentially private idiolects. Each of us have our own language, and communication amounts to a handshake across idiolects. A crucial difficulty with this view is that it fails to account adequately for the objective norms that govern our use of language in communication, for the protocols, if you will, that enable the handshakes. If the only thing I know about Groucho Marx is that he wrote Das Kapital, then my mind is a poor reference for the meaning of the sentence Groucho Marx wrote Das Kapital. But in fact, when the error is pointed out to me, I blushingly stand corrected, and not for the sake of a handshake, but because I quickly learned that I was simply wrong in my use of a name in our common language. We may adjust to each other's idiosyncrasies in speaking, say English, but the foundation of our communication is that we're both English speakers. I am speaking to an audience in English, and the members of the audience are listening to English, or anyway, my version of it. One might want to argue that this misplacing of names is a minor transgression. I merely have to correct my internal lexicon, or alternatively, I have to revise my system of beliefs. Parenthetically, this dependence of personal meaning and personal belief was emphasized in the writings of Donald Davidson, who, I believe, was concerned to defend the conception of language as idiolect. But Wittgenstein's discussion of rule following, which applies in general to the application of concepts, it cuts much deeper. I'll say more about this soon, but Saul Kripke, in his book Wittgenstein on Rules and Private Language, an elementary exposition, clearly states part of the conclusion of Wittgenstein's arguments in terms of a particular example of rule following. I would say I think that he understands it, but he states it. The context is that no one has ever added numbers as high as 68 and 57 before. Kripke writes, when I respond in this way rather than another to such a problem as 68 plus 57, I can have no justification for one response rather than another. There is no fact about me that distinguishes between my meaning plus and my meaning plus, where plus is an operation that agrees with addition up to but not including, what is it now?
68, 57.
But then differs. Indeed, there's no fact about me that distinguishes between my meaning a definite function by plus, which determines my responses in new cases, and my meaning nothing at all. Kripke counts this as a statement of a skeptical paradox, but it is only a skeptical paradox if one begins with the assumption that some fact about me, other than the mere fact that I'm a speaker of the relevant language, that justifies my response. In fact, Wittgenstein's argument should be read as a refutation of exactly that assumption. He wrote in section 201, this is Philosophical Investigations, and what Kripke was referring to was the earlier part of this passage. This was our paradox. The italics are mine, but it was clear from the context that he intended no abiding paradox. It should be read as a part of an extended argument for a quite different way of thinking about meaning and rights and wrongs of linguistic activity. I should perhaps emphasize that rejecting the view from inside, one is not rejecting the role of the mind or of the brain in learning and using language. Detailed evidence accumulates for the existence of structures in societies and in the mind or brain that account for the historical development of languages and for our individual ability to learn and use them. But these are answers to causal questions of how a language developed and how the individual user learned and uses the language. They're not answers to the normative question about correct use of the language. In opposition to the view from outside, I want to suggest a view from the inside. A language is not a system of idiots, but a social activity, and what words mean is a question ultimately of what goes on in individual minds, but the role the words play in linguistic interchange of how they are used in the linguistic community. Even when I'm engaged in soliloquy, I soliloquize basically in English. Thus, I'm accepting a version of the formula meaning is use, which Wittgenstein didn't quite state. When I speak of use, I'm not referring in any way to mental states. I'm referring only to the extensional behavior of the language user. And whether or not a person understands the word, or better, the degree to which they understand, is a question solely of the extent to which the person's usage is in accordance with the meaning, with the common usage. Let me emphasize that behavior is a criteria not because the person's usage is evidence of an internal state, though indeed it might be, but because understanding the words is nothing but the disposition or propensity to use and react to them appropriately. Again, note that I'm using the term act in the extensional sense. Throwing the switch and turning on the lamp are the same act. This distinguishes the view that I want to support from that of others, for example, John McDowell, who would accept the above formula, that is, meaning is use, but would infuse the notion of linguistic use with an intentional element, namely with intentions, now with a capital T. So here, both in, I think, Cal's case and mine, we're offering alternative readings of Wittgenstein, but at the same time we're offering alternative views of how things are. But, yeah. It follows from this that speaking about meaning makes an implicit reference to a linguistic community. I'll forego discussion of the various ways in which this is a very elastic notion. The question of the meaning of a given expression of what counts as correct usage often has no precise answer. Well, yeah. In contrast with the view from inside, there's no problem about communication on the view from outside. Whatever the physical, psychological, and social mechanisms that drive it, a language is a system of communication. I've noted that on the idiolect conception of language, meaning and understanding, grasping meaning, are essentially the same thing. Speaker's meaning versus hearer's meaning. According to the view from outside, they are, of course, significantly different. Given our position that linguistic meaning is ultimately explained in terms of use in the extensional sense in a community, the second part of the thesis is forced on us, that the only criterion for whether or not the agent understands a linguistic expression, i.e. grasps its meaning, is what he does or would do, again in the extensional sense. There is, of course, an implicit holism. Understanding an expression implies some level of understanding the language, and whether or not one understands is a question of what one does or would do. Wittgenstein sums this up yes, sums it up in a passage which I didn't include. To understand a sentence means to understand a language. To understand a language means to have mastered a technique. Clearly, there's no threshold of understanding. Understanding whether it is of an expression, a rule, a theory, or a language or a theory is a matter of degree. We understand it to the extent that we use and react to it in suitable ways. What counts as suitable in this respect is obviously defies precise description. At what stage does an infant really understand the words that it's beginning to learn? How high does the student have to score on a test in arithmetic to be said to understand the rule for adding numbers? So I'm talking about, so I'm taking the position that understanding language is simply being disposed to use and react to it more or less correctly. Viewed solely from the inside, as a state internal to the agent, linguistic competence is nothing but a system of dispositions or propensities. The sole criterion for whether or not one has such a disposition is how one acts, in the extensional sense of acts. This is what Wittgenstein meant when, in the continuation of the above passage in 2:1, he wrote, for what we thereby show is that there is a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation, but which, from case to case of application, is exhibited in what we call following the rule and going against it. The specific issue in the passage, of course, is understanding rules, but the larger context is understanding of linguistic expressions and language in general. And the only criterion for understanding is what, in fact, the agent has done, does, or will do, in the extensional sense. But being a user of a particular language is more than just having some complex system of dispositions to use and react to sounds and marks considered in isolation. The dispositions need to add up to a competence in that language. And here the anti-Aristotelianism is showing. What makes it a competence is nothing internal to the agent. Rather, it is that the dispositions are in conformity with the communal linguistic practice. Linguistic competence is not a property of the agent in isolation. It makes essential reference to the linguistic community. It is possible that the sheer complexity of the network of dispositions to act and react that are involved in what we would judge to be linguistic competence has led many to postulate something in the mind that is outside the scope of ordinary natural science to account wholesale for our linguistic competence. Just as the sheer complexity of many structures that have evolved in the physical universe have led people to postulate what they did, that they did not naturally evolve at all, but are the creatures of an intelligent designer. But the black hole of intentionality, like the black hole of intelligent design, blocks off the search for truly informative accounts of complex phenomena. The idea that there is something in the mind that accounts for the meaningfulness of our linguistic behavior, something other than simply causal mechanisms for the dispositions to behave as themselves, is suggested by the fact that we sometimes consciously consciously meaning or consciously intending something or other. But however the conscious meaning or intending is to be understood, it is far from accounting for very much of our linguistic behavior. Cyril even has pointed out that in order to provide a full account of rationality in terms of intentions, we would have to accept that there are intentions of which we are unaware. For example, in reading these lines, there are no conscious meanings or intentions behind my reading. Simply reading, and in the same sense, I simply wrote them. When I'm balancing my accounts, I'm not generally consciously intending to do arithmetic, to follow the rules of addition or better subtraction. If I'm thinking of anything at all, it's likely to be how I managed to spend so much money. Once in a while, one gets confused and consciously appears to the rules for adding or subtracting numbers in order to get back on track. And once in a while, we appeal to the rules to convince others. But for the most part, when we act linguistically, we are acting unreflectively. Let's see if I got that one. Nope. When I follow a rule, I do not choose, I follow the rule blindly. That's paragraph 219. The intention, I'm sort of paralleling an argument of something I believe with the text that Wittgenstein believed it too. I'm not fully convinced of it, but I can find passages that argue for it. The intentionality hypothesis is postulating something that lies behind our linguistic activity and is intended to explain it. But what have these behind-the-scenes meanings and intentions to do with the conscious sense of meaning or intending that was their origin? A difficulty that many writers have ascribed to the position that I'm advocating is that it seems to commit one to an empiricist view of the nature of grammatical and logical norms. If the warrant for my linguistic behavior is not internal to me, but rather resides in a communal practice, then what is right or wrong linguistically or logically is an empirical question, the answer to which is to be found by investigating how people in the community actually behave. It is this conclusion that has led to the view that Wittgenstein himself was more or less a skeptic. Desperate measures have been taken to avoid this consequence. John McDowell's has been to reach back to Aristotle's notion of second nature. For him, use is no longer to be understood extensionally, and competence viewed as a property of the agent no longer simply refers to dispositions in the extensional sense. Use for him in this context means mindful use, where the mind shares in a second nature, something specifically human and achieved by suitable training. Under this conception, objective meaning is brought into contact with private meaning because all the agents in question are acting in the light of second nature. My inner compulsion to make a particular linguistic or logical move is an expression of objective norms because the compulsion is triggered by our common second nature. For McDowell, second nature lies outside the domain of natural science. Contrary to this position, I would say that second nature is simply a part of nature. It is certainly true that the linguistic and rational competence is more complex than other kinds of abilities that we acquire by training, such as gymnastic abilities, which in fact was Aristotle's original contrast. But as I've already suggested, complexity doesn't argue for extranatural. Nature is very complex. In our day, it seems already quite clear that however complex the learning of linguistic skills and the development of rationality may be, this is a continuum with the learning of other skills, cognitive and non-cognitive, and is within the domain of natural science. But anyway, a second nature outside the logical space of causes is not needed to account for norms and the role they play in our linguistic and rational lives. Within the linguistic community, there simply is agreement in the use of language. That is what makes it a linguistic community. But an element of this agreement in use of the language is agreement about the use of the language, a second order level of agreement about various linguistic rights and wrongs, about what we should or should not do linguistically, about correct word usage, grammatical, logical construction, and so on. But this agreement is not the result of an empirical investigation of what members of the community actually do. Knowing the rights and wrongs of language, being able to evaluate linguistic behavior, is just another level of knowing the language itself, of being a member of the community. We not only can add numbers, but we can check whether the computation is true. We not only go 2, 4, 6, so on, 1000, 1002, 1004, but we know that 2, 4, 6, so on, 1000, 1002, 1006 is wrong. This second order knowledge of rights and wrongs of linguistic behavior exists and conforms to the rough extent that it does with our first order linguistic behavior, is simply a fact of nature, perhaps to be explained in part by the need for language teaching in order for the language to survive from generation to generation. Language is, of course, an empirical phenomenon, and what counts as right or wrong in linguistic usage is a contingent matter. It might have been otherwise. One might, for that reason, feel that the laws of logic or arithmetic, for example, are contingent, that they might have been otherwise. But there's a confusion here. What we can conclude from our argument is that it's contingently true. I'm sorry, I've lost myself. What we can conclude from our argument to be contingently true is not that this or that sentence, but rather the fact that we use the constituent terms in the sentence in the way that we do. Indeed, the fact that we use any expression in the way that we do is always a contingent matter. But this in no way implies that in using the constituent expressions in the way we do, we are not expressing a necessary truth. Of course, there has, in fact, to be some consistency in usage in order for there to be grammatical and logical norms. Without some such constancy, there wouldn't be a language. In this sense, we may say that grammatical and logical necessity ride on the back of contingency. But this does not destroy necessity. It's an empirical fact that the inscription 2 + 2 = 4, the sentence, the equation, is a sentence and expresses truth. But it's not an empirical contingent fact that 2 + 2 = 4. It's a contingent fact that we have names for the Boolean operations and the rules governing their use. But the information that a Boolean expression codes is not contingent. This is at least a part of what Wittgenstein meant when he wrote. So here's alter ego. So what you're saying is that human agreement decides what is true and what is false. He always has to have somebody to put down. And the answer, it's what human beings say that is true and false, and and they agree in the language they use. That's not an agreement in opinions, but in a form of life.
Bill, just so you know, that's 45 minutes, but you have some leeway. That's 45 minutes, but you have considerable leeway. You've gone on 45 minutes.
I've gone. How much time should I have?
That's fine. But that's sort of the length we were aiming for, but you're welcome to continue. I mean, there's plenty, there's more time.
Okay, yeah. Okay. It's an empirical, thanks, yeah. It's an empirical fact that we can learn to reason and communicate that with suitable preparation, the student will continue the series 024, 1000, 1002, 1004, and not 1024, 1000, 1002, 1006. And we'll add numbers according to plus and not to quas for Kripke's example. That with suitable prompts, we will interpret the native speaker's gavagai as a reference to rabbits and not to time slices of rabbits or whatever, Klein's example. And that when we witness lots of green things having a property P and no green things without the property, we will take this as evidence that all green things are P and not evidence that all blue things are P, to Goodman's example. These are examples of the kinds of empirical conditions under which our kind of language and reasoning is possible. Language and science builds on top of this. My argument has been that meaningful discourse about objects does not presuppose language-independent interaction with them. Our physical, that's not the way meaning seems to go, at least on the view that I'm expressing. Our physical interaction with objects obviously plays a crucial role, both in the historical evolution of languages and in our individual language learning. But that causal interaction should not be confused with reference, an objective relation that linguistic expression has to objects, which doesn't depend on any kind of actual interaction. The question then becomes, what is it that determines what objects we are speaking of when we say use a name? How does reference work? I think I will skip, let's see. The ontological corollary to the formula meaning is use, and the one pertinent to our ultimate aim concerns the objective knowledge of ideal things, is expressed early in the philosophical investigations. A paraphrase of part of paragraph 10 is, what a word signifies is shown by the kind of use that it has. Let me see if I can just skip some of this. Let me say, I think the question the main question would be then, what kind of grounds does one have for introducing a kind of object? That is, the view that I'm expressing seems to be completely free. Anything goes. One can make up any kind of story. Yeah, the challenge has been raised many times from this point of view that I'm representing, namely that it would seem to admit all kinds of ridiculous ontologies, a fantasy world, a weird new mathematical object, whatever. On what grounds do we challenge them? To simply say that they don't really exist is to imply a transcendental ground. But George Cantor already addressed this challenge in the case of mathematics in 1883, in his Foundations of a General Theory of Manifolds, in which he first introduced his transfinite numbers. He first of all suggested that the meaning of the term pure mathematics is better expressed by the term free mathematics. And then he went on to write, mathematics in its development is entirely free and only bound in the self-evident respect that its concepts must be both consistent with each other and also stand in exact relations ordered by definitions. His prose isn't always very good and clear. To these concepts which have previously been introduced and are already at hand and established, it is not necessary, I believe, to fear, as many do, that these principles present any danger to science. Every mathematical concept carries within itself the necessary corrective. If it is fruitless or unsuited for its purpose, then that appears very soon through its uselessness, and it will be abandoned for lack of success. Kant's point can be made more general. No truth or existence police are needed. If a contractor begins to put up new structures in the outskirts of Old Town that bear no relation to the needs or desires of the people, no suburb will grow there, and he will go bankrupt. So that has a reference to something I skipped. But if someone introduces a new realm of being that makes no sense to us, we simply ignore it. If someone down the hall begins developing a weird new mathematics with no interesting relation to what has gone before, worry not, he or she won't get tenure. Of course, it is a consequence of this position that the sense of existence in which the ideal exists is the humble, no big deal sense internal to mathematics, which we learn in the context of learning mathematics. But some of the considerations many mentioned earlier, by the same humility is needed in connection with natural existence. For the conclusion is not that there is a univocal, across-the-board notion of existence according to which ideal things exist. It's rather that there's no such notion, and that the only across-the-board meaning of existence is what is expressed by the logical laws for the existential quantifier. Notions such as that of object, existence, and identity take their meaning in the language, not as a part of a scaffolding, except in the sense of this logical scaffolding, which is what justifies calling it identity and object. I have no time left.
No, feel free to take some anyway. I'll take a few more minutes.
Yeah. Okay. All right, that will be enough. For one conclusion is that there is no univocal across-the-board notion of existing according to which ideal objects exist. It is rather that there is no such notion, yes. One should expect full support of my point of view from Wittgenstein, who wrote, for this is what disputes between idealists and solipsists, I think this means on the one hand and realists on the other, look like. The one party attacks the normal form of expression as if they were attacking a statement, and the others defend it as if they were stating facts recognizable by any reasonable human being. It was kind of ironical that I was drawing on Wittgenstein to support a view about the existence of ideal things, and then when it comes to this passage, And the one thing missing is the question of existence of ideal things. It's the realist about physical objects, the idealist about other minds and so on. And that's very strange, I think, and I think the only answer is that it's just his time warp. I mean, Wittgenstein's conception of mathematics was 19th century. I mean, that already, he explicitly rejects set theory, but this was in the 20s or 30s when set theory was already part of the warp and woof of various branches in mathematics. That's hard to understand, but that's what one has to understand to why the conflict between the realists and the people who believe that there's a real question of a transcendental question of whether things exist or not. He talks about the solipsists and the people who believe in other minds, the idealists and the people who believe in physical objects, but he doesn't speak about ideal objects. In particular, the anti-Platonist should be listed with the idealist and the solipsist in the camp of the transcendental, they don't exist, folk, and the relative Platonist about mathematical objects should be included among the realists about physical objects and about other minds in the camp of the transcendental, they do exist folks. It's ironical, given that my aim is to defend ordinary mathematical practice against skepticism about ideal objects, that the argument is somewhat, yes, that the argument led me to Wittgenstein and then at the end of the book completely disagreed with me in my conclusion. But leaving Wittgenstein's particular time warp in connection with mathematics aside, there's a wonderful liberation implicit in philosophical investigation that fits with the bold approach of Dedekind, Cantor, Hilbert to ontology. For those of us philosophers who have found distasteful the constraint and demand for humility bound up with Kant's response to skepticism, the vision is most... Sorry, Michael.
I didn't get which it was.
Oh, shall I read it again?
Sure.
Okay. For those of us philosophers who have found distasteful the constraint and demand for humility bound up with Kant's response to skepticism, reason restricted to its proper object, namely the natural world, which is given to us in intuition, and the basic laws of this world hardwired into its givenness. The vision is most welcome that, indeed, with some prompting from nature, we are free to give full rein to our creative rational powers and to decide without any but logical constraint what we want to talk about. End of sermon. Sorry.